Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Joris van Etten. I'm a senior urban development specialist with the Asian Development Bank. I'm residing in our office in Indonesia. And I'm very happy to have you here with us today on this seminar as part of the Southeast Asia Development Symposium. And this seminar this afternoon will look at reinventing smart cities after COVID-19. We have a great panel here. We have an exciting lineup of ways to get you involved in the discussion. And we look forward to this next 1.5 hours in order to together explore how COVID-19 is really been a push for cities to innovate, how COVID-19 has helped cities to digitalize, and how COVID-19 is helping us to rethink how to look at a long-term resilience of cities and how to what kind of tools, digital tools, we can use for that. I want to very briefly introduce my panelists, which you can see also, which will come to you today in this afternoon. We are going to have a first a kind of introduction by a colleague who I work with as part of the ASEAN Australia Smart Cities Trust Fund, and then we continue with some examples from impact stories of how we really see changes in the region taking place. But before we do that, we really want to make use of digital technology in itself and ask you to contribute. So we have a first poll, and if Dan, who is helping us with this, if Dan could help us to launch that poll, that would be great. I see that you can see that on your screen. And the first audience poll is indeed, what makes a livable city for you? Of course, these are 5 maybe competing arguments or overlapping arguments, but what is really important for you as a citizen in wherever you are? So livable cities are first and foremost green, competitive, inclusive, resilient, or smart cities. Please, I look forward to your feedback. Right. Okay. It's still going on here. All right, I give you another 5 minutes. 5 minutes, 5 seconds. All right, and let's close that. Let's close that poll. Then it's quite clear here that inclusive cities is something which is really at the forefront of people's idea of what makes a city livable. So it's not so much about the infrastructure there; it's how the infrastructure creates a livable and exciting environment to live in, where all citizens can contribute and have fulfilling lives. I would like to pass on now to Søren. Søren is based in Copenhagen, so he got up very early this morning. And Søren and I, as I said already earlier, we work together as part of the ASEAN Australia Smart Cities Trust Fund, and he's team leader of the Rambøll team, helping us in this field. He's an expert in master planning, urban development, and transportation and transport planning, and he will go through us about his thoughts, and he will share his thoughts about reinventing smart cities after COVID-19 and looking at long-term resilience. Søren, can I pass it on to you?
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Joris, for the introduction. I'll try to set the scene for the discussion this afternoon, morning, and discuss about reinventing smart cities after COVID-19 and how we can use the term build back smarter. Next slide, please. And the corona crisis has definitely set the contours for the scene quite clear for us. We are very and actually extremely vulnerable in the way we have organized the frames around our lives. We're organizing ourselves in mega cities. Densification is one of the urban development trends. We are relying on mass transit, where the efficiency is dependent on us accepting to stand close in buses, in trains, and so on. We're expecting instant global accessibility, and that we can have a meeting on the other side of the world within a few hours. But we realize now that the smallest of all things, a virus of a diameter of 20 nanometers, can put it all on hold. It can jeopardize the way we are living, our social culture, our economy, and the sheer feasibility of our future living. And actually, we have been warned. We've been warned a number of times. The Spanish flu in the early 19th century, where millions of people were killed. The SARS and MERS epidemic in Southeast Asia, the financial crisis. Tsunamis have been wiping out Japanese cities and even an atomic power plant. And Philippine coastal cities are wiped out by typhoons. Volcano outbreaks are grounding international flights for months. Terror attacks, and so on and so forth. We have organized ourselves in a very, very vulnerable settings, in societies, in large and dense cities, and we have no plan B. Next slide, please. The restrictions keeps us away from mass transit, at least to a certain point. The mass transit is the veins of cities that are keeping cities alive. But what will the consequences be if we are moving away from mass transit, from public transport? What will the new normal be? Will we be moving back to individual transportation means? It's okay if it is bicycles. It's not okay if we're going back to cars. How will the cities perform with the public transportation on half capacity, or maybe even less than half capacity, and the society on full speed? This could actually put a stop to growth, a growth that is super important now more than ever, in a situation where we need to reinvent our economies of the individual persons and of the societies and whole countries. Next slide, please. Restrictions demand us not to crowd in public realm. In many countries, people are fleeing out of the cities to the countryside. More than ever, people are buying summer houses in the countryside and moving out away from the crowded cities. Some are deemed to stay in the infected areas, creating huge inequalities. The poor are always the losers in this game. What will the new normal be in this case? A new urban sprawl? And how will we commute in the future, living in the countryside, working in the cities? Will businesses move out of the cities because we are working from home and not need the same amount of office space as today? How will that influence the economics of the cities? And how will it influence the future urban planning? Next slide, please. In the last 10 years, the paradigm has been that we are migrating to cities and that 70% of the world's population will live in cities in 2050. Is that still valid? Will we see a new tendency of people moving away from the big cities, or at least not moving to the cities at the same speed as today? And how will that influence land use, space for farming, and energy consumption for cooling, heating, and transportation? Next slide, please. So now is the time actually to rethink, to create resilience, to create redundancy and robustness. Next slide. The new urban structures and retrofitting of city districts we are creating now will last for the next 100 years. It is not sufficient just to respond to the corona situation, which is of course filling our lives today. But in the long perspective, in this city history perspective, Corona is just a comma. So we must create resilience and robustness towards future shocks and stresses that will come. We know it, we have seen it. Some of them, the shocks and stresses are even known, but some of them are unknown. We don't know what will come in the future. Until now, we have seen sustainability as the best practice planning regime, and we've used it the last 40 years, 20 years, 25 years. And we have gained a lot retrofitting and building optimized infrastructure. But now, best practice is simply not enough. Best practice is retrospective, it is system-oriented, and more of the same. It has no answer to Corona situation, to economic crisis, to volcano outbreaks, to climate change. We must invent a new next practice, which is human-centric instead of system-centric, and which is based on resilience instead of just optimization. Next slide, please. And some of the efficient tools for this journey and solutions, they are right in front of us. They are not behind us. We have to look forward. And we are at the brink of a fundamental transition. We see a leapfrog transition within the communication sector. 5G is allowing real Internet of Things, real autonomous mobility, and real flexible living. The climate change is driving changes. It's setting up demands for new urban planning conditions. It's demanding that we create more mobility, but less, at the same time, less traffic. We see economic transitions towards shared economy, and within the transportation sector, we see a movement away from individual ownership of transportation means to subscription of mobility services. We also see the remote working, which has escalated a lot during the Corona crisis. And the Corona crisis is showing a profound vulnerability, but it has also shown a transition towards personal awareness. Ourselves, the whole world's population, understanding the consequences of crowding. And we see a profound readiness for transition. Actually, we changed our way of living from one day to the next, where we were grounded and put into our homes and working from home. So we see a huge transition readiness. Next slide. So we are at a time where we can reinvent cities as framework for truly smart societies. And we have the smart technologies at hand to enable and support the journey towards resilience. And this is what we think is Build Back Smarter. Next slide, please. Thank you for allowing me to set the scene for the discussion of this afternoon. Back to you, Joris.
Thank you very much, Søren. That was brilliant in terms of setting the scene. Indeed, building back smarter as a way to really seize the opportunity which is being provided by the stress under which many of us are under at the moment. One of the elements which you really highlighted is that the importance of resilience and the importance of being ready, not just for this particular shock, but also for future shocks and stresses. And somebody who has been working on resilience, but more from a climate perspective lens, is Amit Proti, and he will. He's with the regional director of the Resilient Cities Network, regional director for Asia and the Pacific. And he leads some of the resilience practice across Asia Pacific region for the Resilient Cities Network. And he's worked on thematic topics related to urban resilience, including environmental planning, urban policy, land use, etc., etc. So as now the resilience lens is more on resilience to other shocks and stresses than just climate, it will be very exciting to hear from him. But prior to that, I would like to ask another poll question to you all. So if we could see that already here, is that there's already a question related to your resilience in your city, and to what extent your city is resilient for future shocks and stresses, whether they are natural or man-made or whatever shocks and stresses. So quite interesting. Somebody says that is not applicable at all. Maybe you do not live in a city, but only very few are indicating that your city is very resilient. Most of them are fairly resilient. So let me pass on to, while we close this poll, let me pass on to Amit and say, are you surprised by the results of this feedback? It looks like most of the participants in this webinar think that cities are quite resilient. How do you see that, and how do you see actually in terms of the discussion around resilience? How do you see cities in the region responding to the opportunities and challenges which COVID-19 has thrown at them? Over to you, Amit.
Thank you, Joris, and thank you, Søren, for that introduction. I think it's interesting to see this poll because we all have a very different perspective of what resilience is. And I can say that having worked over the last 4 or 5 years across the Asia Pacific region and across the globe on trying to get cities to really think about what is resilience in their context. And when we're in the middle of this pandemic, one starts to see what are the questions that are emerging from our cities who have been thinking about resilience now, like I said, for a while, for about 4 or 5 years. So what I've done, next slide, it's really starting to see what can we learn. The idea is that there is a pandemic going on that is putting this concept of resilience in the front and center of all of our discussions. And cities are doing something. And what are they doing? And I think that's really where I want to spend my time right now, is to reflect back certain kinds of trends that we're observing, certain kinds of questions that we are hearing from our cities, and relate that back to both smart technology as well as where we can go from here. Yeah. So some questions that we've started to, some trends that we've started to see is during the pandemic, and this is not unique to 1 or 2 cities, this has happened in quite a few cities, local governments have had to reorganize, and I'll give you an example how that has happened, but when the pandemic hit, local governments responded in a certain way. Part of that was they had to reorganize their functioning. Local governments have, of course, leveraged technology in certain ways, and I will share that in a second. Local governments have been communicating on, how our citizens and other stakeholders, what are they to do during this pandemic? And that's again using technology to communicate. Local governments have relied on building partnerships to respond to the pandemic. Local governments have reached out or tried to reach out to identify where are the vulnerable populations across their cities. And of course, local governments are starting to think about, what do we do post? There is an immediate need to get beyond the pandemic, and then there's a long-term intention that has to be brought into what is that what is that link between what you do now and what can you achieve for future sustainability and resilience. So these are certain trends that we've noticed that are emerging. If you go to the next slide. I really want to share these examples because I want the audience to start thinking in their own context, what is happening when we're talking about resilience. So here's an example from Buenos Aires. Very early on when the pandemic hit, the local government essentially divided themselves into 3 buckets. One bucket was completely about crisis management. And if you look around the world, that's what is happening in a lot of cities. There is a part of government that is focused completely on managing the pandemic crisis that is still going on. There's a second bucket, which is that government functions have to continue. You're still paying your parking tickets and you're still going and buying a house and you're still doing all those things. So there is still a core bucket of functions that do everything that is not pandemic related, and that has to continue. So that's the second bucket. And the third one, which some cities are doing better than others, are saying, we need to start thinking about what's next. So we need to get past this current economic crisis, health crisis, vaccination challenges, to start saying, what are we doing next? How are we making sure that our metro, that we've taken a loan from the ADB, how are we paying that loan back? There is this question of what next. So there are three buckets that you can start to see governments organizing themselves into. And that also links to how they've actually reallocated their labor force. So for example, this example from the UK is the Royal Mail Postal Service was actually spending a lot of time delivering medical aid and checking on vulnerable populations during the early part of the pandemic. So again, government functions shifted to respond to this pandemic. And this poses a question of, okay, the pandemic will end, but there will be a next shock, next shock, next shock. How do you reorganize your government system in a way that you can actually respond to the next shocks? The second trend that we've noticed is this whole notion of leveraging technology, and some cities have done it really well. Tel Aviv, very early on, essentially said, we will shift very quickly to a virtual municipality. What did that mean? That meant that they said, we have to make sure that about 3,000 of our employees are able to function virtually. They set up call centers, virtual call centers. They set up, ability for government employees to work from home. They set up ability for city leaders to do virtual calls. And this was an anecdotal. They started with the mayor. So once the mayor said, I'm going to use Zoom, everybody else below started using Zoom. So they started to think about how do you shift from a physical government office to actually a virtual government office. And they leveraged technology doing that. Again, that's a lesson one can use going forward and saying, if we have the situation of government shutdown, can we function virtually? It also allowed a lot of innovation to start happening in this space. So, governments, Tel Aviv has actually reached out and organized several hackathons where they're encouraging the entrepreneur community to start building apps and tools to support bringing in, elderly population, like monitoring them, getting them food, et cetera, et cetera. So starting to find solutions through technology, through organizing hackathons during this pandemic. Again, that culture that they're creating can continue. And one more example from Buenos Aires is the city had already started thinking about virtual education. So they had been training their teachers to use virtual education. They had been providing tools to students before the pandemic. This was nothing to do with the pandemic. This was just an intention of being able to have the capacity to do digital education. And the moment the pandemic hit, they were completely ready because they could actually mobilize, kids had done some training, teachers had done some training, and they could leverage technology to continue the education. So again, thinking about how do you use education, how have you used it during the pandemic, and what are the lessons going forward? Next slide. I think communication, we've seen in this region, one of the best examples is from Singapore. Singapore learned from SARS and MERS. So they had already experienced a pandemic and they had learned from it. And they had put in place a readiness and response plan that was all about communicating with your urban residents as to what people need to do during the pandemic. They were ready. So when COVID hit, they had the ability to quickly mobilize and start setting out simple ways of communicating with everybody. So I'm living in Singapore. I have an app. I have a WhatsApp channel. I get a message every day from the government. If you look at this is from last April, 1,400 cases, so many in this place, so many in that place. It gives me knowledge to start making decisions on my own. And again, they leveraged the prior pandemic to learn from it and then set up a communication system that has functioned well during this pandemic. So again, I think for governments to think about this pandemic and saying, how do we build resilience is also saying, let's think about communication and how have we done that now and how can we continue to do it going forward. Around communication, again, London has been working with the nonprofit business partners for a while. So their governance model is actually about working with other partners. They were very quickly, when the pandemic hit, able to set up a portal, set up communication channels for a variety of stakeholder audiences to say, If you want to help, here's how you can help. If you're affected, here's how you can actually do something about it. So building partnership through leveraging their web portal and their relationships, again, was something that London shows a very good example of. And this is not unique to London. There's a lot of other cities as well who have started to use technology, use a variety of platforms to build partnerships with a variety of stakeholders who are important during this response phase and who will be equally important as we go forward. Next slide. I know, Søren, you said, let's get away from systems thinking. I think my take on that is you're talking about the physical infrastructure, physical systems thinking. I think from when we talk about resilience, it's a combination of physical and social. And I want to cite this really good example from Quito in Ecuador, where Quito is one of the resilient cities, part of our resilient cities network. They had been working on a resilience strategy for about 4 years. In their strategy, about 3 years back already, so 2017, they had identified that they wanted to build food security in the urban system. They were focused on that for job growth. They were focused on that for managing land. They were focusing on that for starting to, provide food to the vulnerable population. Now, that system existed. They had food banks in place. They had a way of managing supply chain in place. When the pandemic hit, they suddenly could actually feed 100,000 vulnerable population. So this was a response to the pandemic, but this was about already thinking about resilience and thinking about food security, and then using that during the pandemic to essentially, what they were thinking about worked during the pandemic and could work in other kinds of shock situations as well. So the reason I'm trying to highlight these examples is I'm trying to break down resilience into the use of technology for certain purposes. And those purposes are important because those purposes will continue no matter what is the shock that you experience in the future. The ability to communicate, the ability to build partnerships, the ability to leverage technology for a variety of reasons, the ability to think about some social systems like a food security system that can support your population during a crisis. All of these are different ways of building resilience. And I like, Søren, you're showing the historical pandemics that we've experienced. I'll add to that is that if you look at urban planning and city planning, a lot of major transformation has actually happened after certain shock events. So when we talk about our modern zoning and urban planning, that's actually a partly reflection of the crowdedness that was experienced in the industrial city of the 19th century. And to break away from that, we now had the modern ways of planning. And similarly, the modern sewerage system actually really took off after a cholera outbreak in the 19th century. So the reason I'm highlighting that is even historically, we see examples where pandemics or public health crises or crises have led to large-scale transformation. And we are at that point now. I don't think we all have the answers, but I think we have to start asking the right questions. Next slide. So for us as a network, what we are really trying to do is bring together from the network of cities these questions and these experiences that are emerging, and starting to build a platform for learning where these questions, there are similarities in questions. There are some cities who actually have done something better than others. We are trying to bring that into the forefront. And that is, and that next slide is my last slide. So. Next slide. Great, thank you. So that was it from my side. Just learning from where we are to build where we want to go. Thank you. Back to you, Rars.
Thank you very much for that. Much appreciated. So I understand the role of local government is important here. The role of digital technology is important. The role of utilizing those opportunities of shocks and stresses is very important. One thing which your network used to talk a lot about was urban planning and the role of urban planning to enhance resilience. I would love to hear now a bit more. We will talk about urban planning, but I would love to hear from the audience a bit more on the role of urban planning. So our next audience poll relates to the role of urban planning and how urban planning is a tool to enhance to build back smarter. Could we see that? Oh, so far it's a bit of a boring. All right. Sorry, I got some technical problems here, but so we see that the role of urban planning is extremely important. Thank you very much. That brings us to maybe not a surprise then, indeed, but that brings us to our next speaker, which is Ibu Wiwandari Handayani, who is associate professor at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Diponegoro University in Semarang, Indonesia. She's an expert in the field of urban-rural linkages and regional planning, and her research mainly focuses on urban and regional resilience. And she's been working particularly with the Semarang city government to develop the Semarang resilience strategy. And actually what we wanted to hear from Ibu Wiwi is to what extent indeed urban planning, as we know, is changing, as Søren was referring to, and to some extent also Amit. So what's the role of urban planning in post-COVID-19 recovery? What's the role of how cities plan their cities and implement these plans? So over to you, Ibu Wiwi.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pak Yoris. I'm happy to take this opportunity to share some highlights on urban responses to further operationalize smart city concept as a part of the COVID-19 recovery. Next slide, please. The smart city concepts becomes more critical in Asia, including in Southeast Asia, as many cities are likely to grow very rapidly, forming what we call as mega urban or metropolitan regions with millions of inhabitants, even more than 10 millions. And the improved connectivity and mobility have been creating what we call as extended urban region or EMR. To some extent, we can see it as a positive sign of a growing economy. But however, when we connect that to the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to carefully investigate the development path, as the spread of the COVID-19 cases is dominantly experienced by very dense urban or urban areas or big cities that have been expanded to the peri-urban regions. So how would be, or what would be smart city post-pandemic? I would say that smart city is an essential and strategic concept to be further improved, mainly in the context of urban planning and development, to be implemented mainly to optimizing the use of technology in many dimensions that form the urban system, as maybe showing on the slide. And primarily learning from the COVID-19 pandemic is how we can control the people's mobility. Because when we talk about smart cities, there are many dimensions as shown on the slide, and it is expected that the use of smart city technologies in these multi-dimension elements result in cost efficiencies, resilient infrastructures, and an improved urban experience. Yeah, next slide, please. Smart city, however, in many perspectives, the critical urban response is basically on how to allocate the urban growth and how, again, to control people's mobility. There are at least three important approaches that might need to be further improved by the smart city application in the context of urban development, as they are on how the smart city are able to manage the density, the connectivity, and mobility. I would like a little bit to emphasize on the need to consider the optimum size of the city to ensure the people's quality of life. As briefly elaborate, the general pathway of the urban growth illustrated on the slide, there are at least three types of the growth management. There are some pros and cons of the compact city concept, but I think in most cases in Asia, urban growth takes place as a combination between the compact city and extended urban regions. Or I call it as an EMR. And these types of growth creating what we call as the urban sprawl. The ideal situation might be in the future, might be like the one on the right. I propose to further promote what we call as polycentricity or concentrated decentralization, promoting to be able for us to manage the city with lower density and expectedly less mobility, as already mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. Yeah, as illustrated on the map, I would like to briefly represent the situation in Indonesia when we can see that the urban expansion in combination with peri-urbanization is clearly seen in the 7 biggest urban agglomeration in Indonesia, whereas the COVID-19 cases also are the highest across the country. We collect the data from the official government website, and the map shows cases from March to October 2020. The highest cases, as also have been discussed by many scholars, take place as the result of the intensive interaction. The impact of the emerging interaction is wider due to the people's mobility between the main city and the peri-urban areas, in addition to the high density, either population density or built-up density in this urban agglomeration. So the strong spatial connection among centers and sub-centers indicated by this mobility, again, has led to the increasing numbers of the COVID-19 cases in the urban center and the surrounding regions. Next slide, please. And yeah, looking at the cluster types in these 7 urban agglomeration and taking Jakarta and Semarang metropolitan as the examples, there are at least 10 types of cluster dominating the transmission: office, religious activities, and so on. And we can see that the office clusters shown that it is the highest experience. Even in Jakarta, it reached up to 67 cases. 67 clusters, up to 3,800 cases only in Jakarta city, not to mention the Bekasi and other peri-urban regions. And this kind of situation may a strategic good entry point for us to further look at promoting smart mobility as an important dimension in smart city concept, to be combined, of course, with the work from home policy in many big cities in Asia. Expectedly in the future to reduce mobility, not only for the need to reduce emission because of the massive use of the car or motorcycle, but also as a new normal, as an adaptive transformation, as the part of the COVID-19 recovery process. So yeah, in the brief, next slide, please. Yeah, so briefly, I would like actually to highlight 2 main critical responses in regard to the urban planning response with the pandemic. First, that we need to, in such an efficient pathway, managing the urban growth. The smart city concept comes to its momentum to limit the speed of the urban growth. Application of smart city approach can limit the speed of the growth, as it allows for maximizing the use of information and technology to deliver city services and enhance urban system that creates cost efficiencies and resilient infrastructure to be able to manage density and mobility. In Indonesia, some initiatives such as the idea to move the capital city to Kalimantan, providing some strategic infrastructure projects such as toll road and industrial zone development outside Java, I think a very strategic approach to create a more balanced development and promoting new growth center to a little bit slowing down the urban expansion of the current big growth city, for example, in Indonesia. And related to that, secondly, I think we need to a little bit more promoting what we call as polycentric metropolitan region, instead of the city center, monocentric, that allows more efficient mobility, creating cities in Asia with a more human scale of service, livable, to be more livable and also more sustainable. So in general, I might say that the pandemic has given us a very important lesson learned, that the balance of urban development is very important, not only for environmental sustainability, but also for providing comfortable and human space for its inhabitants, And in this perspective, I think we need to encourage further the application of the smart city to be continued to implement it in many urban areas in Asia, including in Southeast Asia. Yeah, so I think I will stop here. Thank you very much, Joris.
Thank you very much, Ibu Wiwi. Much appreciated. As myself living in Indonesia, I've seen the change in lifestyles as a result of COVID-19 restrictions, where we particularly see people biking more, and so cities are looking and feeling already different. Jakarta, one of the biggest thoroughfares, now has a bike path, which would have never been possible without this. And it's really difficult, and I hear that from around the world, really difficult to actually get bikes, which for me as a Dutch person, of course, is quite surprising. But then from the Netherlands, for example, another example is that we have a huge gap in terms of housing provision. So now there's discussions about how you can transform existing offices, which are maybe less of a requirement given that people are now more used to work from home, that these offices can be transformed into housing. So thank you very much for that, Ibu Wiwi, to clarify, the planning side of this. I would like to invite everybody who's watching and to keep contributing also through the Q&A platform. Raise your questions. We already had some questions here, and we will get to that at some point. But keep them coming. Much appreciated. We now want to pass on to another audience poll, which is a bit related to what Amit was talking about, which is how cities have been utilizing digital solutions to manage the COVID-19 pandemic in your city. So how much do you feel, and Amit was referring to his experience in Singapore, but how in your city do you feel your city has been able to use digital tools to actually manage the response, to keep performing their essential functions, to keep communicating, and to what extent have they been able to leverage technologies? And it seems there's, at the moment, if I look at the results of the poll, there's a competition between fairly well and not well at all. So thank you for that, for those who contributed to that. But this is also a nice bridge to our next speaker, which is Wendy Leung, who's coming to us from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And Wendy has more than 20 years of product design and development experience in software, communication, and technologies. And she is very keen and passionate about how digital technologies can help real-world problems. So for that, she founded Mobiva, which is a technology startup that harnesses the power of mobility to reduce the impact of disasters with a cloud-based incident and emergency management command system. And with Mobiva, Wendy also was one of the winners of ADB's Digital Against COVID-19 Global Hackathon for its work from anywhere approach. So we're very keen to hear from you, Wendy. This community-based platform for disaster risk reduction and looking at the use of technology to manage COVID pandemic responses or any other future shocks and stresses. What's your experience with your startup when you look at the uptake of this startup, with the uptake of the technology? And can you give us some case studies of how cities in Southeast Asia have been using some of these tools? Over to you, Wendy.
Hi, thank you, Joris, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here and to have the opportunity to share with you how technology with community collaboration can make life easier. Based on what Amit was saying, disaster preparedness capability and emergency management is like your car seatbelt. You put it on as an afterthought. You don't need it until your life depends on it. Well, that's too late. Lives will be lost. Next slide, please. Have a look at these three images. Imagine an earthquake hits your city. Now imagine what you're looking at is the emergency response command centers. How can help be dispatched without a command center? What can we do if your command center is compromised? What lessons do we learn from COVID-19? Picking up from where Amit left off earlier, I'd like to invite the audience to answer these questions. How can a command center continue to operate without access to their servers and telephone systems? How can operators take calls and coordinate emergency services without access to the office? How can technology be employed to mitigate these risks? In a post-COVID-19 world, we need new ideas to build smarter cities. Next slide, please. So in times of emergency, there are two variables which, left unaccounted for, inevitably lead to the tragic, unnecessary loss of life. These variables are time and information. Our design addresses these shortfalls by empowering citizens with a simple yet powerful tool to access in times of crisis. Building a smart community would mean keeping citizens informed using a decentralized multi-node network by combining cloud computing with mobile edge computing. As most command centers are centralized today, this design also serves as a transition and a backup to existing operation centers as cities undergo digital transformation to become more efficient. This is what Amit was saying earlier about virtual command center, but we take this a step further to include both cloud computing and edge computing on one single system. To increase resiliency, the system needs to operate on an individual node, yet be part of a holistic ecosystem to overcome breaks in communications if there is a widespread infrastructure damage. Most times, there's a delay at the telco operator end when it comes to broadcasting early warning alerts and messages. With the system, the local councils are now empowered to broadcast disaster early warning and updates without having to rely on telco providers. This functionality empowers communities to take charge of their own safety and become more resilient to imminent disasters. Next slide, please. Here is a model of a virtual command center using a decentralized communication system for disaster management. We can see that one call for help can be managed and redirected to the relevant emergency personnel in the field seamlessly and rapidly without a fixed physical office location. The diagram shows how a city can be managed on a district level right down to the building level. Based on some experience from the Philippines, we can always, every Filipino knows about the big one that's coming. So every building will have a building manager that's in charge of initiating evacuation. This is traditionally done and still is done using a public address system, a whiteboard that you hope to push out when you're running for your life. In this diagram, you can see a building manager can initiate evacuation from a smartphone without having to use any public address systems. People entering and exiting the building is easily tracked by IoT devices unobtrusively as they enter and egress the entrance. When you enter a building, all safety measures about earthquake and where to go are on the ground floor, and sometimes at the lift lobby on every floor. Can you remember this when you're running for your life? But every one of us will never forget our mobile phone. That's the reality. I'm sure there are many among us that will develop separation anxiety when we can't find our phone. Now, tenants within the building can now access evacuation maps simply from opening a tool using their smartphone and make their way to safety. From the outside, at the muster point, digital roll call and tracking of and hit count is automated, and this information is transmitted to the command center, which can be situated anywhere across multiple different operators in real time. Once a call for help is received, information captured is shared seamlessly in real time across multiple stakeholders to coordinate and reduce response times. So in a situation like this, emergency management becomes more efficient as resources can be allocated efficiently based on the location and the size of the affected population. Then we all consider about the classic $54 question is, what if there's no internet? The system is designed to locate dead zones to establish the impact of the disaster. In reality, in a city, there will be multiple towers within a small area that serves to provide mobile coverage. Not all the towers will be knocked out at the same time. With 5G, the number of mobile towers increases as the range is shorter. Internet connectivity may be spotty, but usually there is always still internet. However, as we move towards urban planning, we do need to consider a total wipeout scenario. For such initial planning, both Bluetooth 4.0 in combination with BLE devices or IoT devices operating as the mesh network should be part of the initial urban planning process. This technology is both ubiquitous, easy to deploy, and affordable. Next slide, please. Here is a view of a command center operator working from home. The current situation of disaster or criminal activities within the community can be easily monitored. Emergency or police resources can be directed where they are needed most. A simple process for incident management is shown on the right. The citizen reports the incident via the mobile app. A notification alert pops up on the operator's desktop, at home, or wherever. The operator conducts triage and looks for the nearest available resource. The dispatcher then dispatches this case to the targeted service, and this is all done via a remote or virtual command center. By using data, citizens have another way to request aid, as in most cases, emergency hotlines will be overwhelmed in times of crisis. Next slide, please. The advantages of a decentralized communication system can be varied. Here we have showcased how our system can address 4 core capabilities that target different community services. Citizens use an intelligent mobile app with portable health records and a unique mobile ID for identification. Emergency field personnel uses the mobile app for communication tracking and conducting field updates in real time. Data integrity and pertinent information is preserved and shared across different community services. This reduces the overall response time and will lead to better patient outcomes. The virtual command center is the heart of the network. With decentralized management and communication, there is no single point of failure, and the lines of communications between all parties are uninterrupted in times of crisis. A smart city needs to maintain a strong, resilient, and responsive incident management and healthcare system, especially in the face of a nationwide disaster or epidemic. I see the future of city living where citizens will use augmented reality with edge computing, not to catch Pokemon, but as an essential tool for inclusive community collaboration and learning. With 5G, augmented reality will become an essential tool for paramedics to connect doctors to disaster victims, providing appropriate medical care fast. Rescue personnel can improve situational awareness by utilizing AR with big data to identify vulnerable hotspots and danger zones. Real-time information with mobility solutions are critical for any city wanting to improve their disaster preparedness capabilities. Technology can make our life easier and better. Reimagine the possibilities and life can be a whole lot more fun. Next slide, please. Before I end, I'd like to invite you to Boracay. We are rolling out a safe travel corridor using Mobiva. Our travel corridor starts from Manila and ends when you depart Boracay. Thank you for your time today. If you have any further questions on what we do, feel free to contact me. My virtual door is always open.
Thank you very much for that, Wendy. The virtual door, I hadn't heard that yet, but that's really, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you for sharing your experience of how tools such as Mobiva can help increase the resilience of and responsiveness of particularly local governments in the face of emergencies. And I'm very much looking forward to the exciting opportunities around 5G and augmented reality, as you indicated. Let's go to our next and final poll for the audience. While the previous poll was related to how well your city has been able to utilize digital solutions to respond to COVID. Actually, here we wanted to bring it a bit broader and ask, to what extent has your city been able to use digital solutions to become more resilient and smart? So besides just the COVID angle, and to what extent has this transition been taking place? I see that, again, a very close run between fairly well and not well at all, where not well at all is a bit overtaking at the moment fairly well. And this is a bridge for me to introduce Donna Rilera Tabangin, who is the head of planning of the local government of Baguio City in the Philippines. Donna is a licensed architect and environmental planner with over 20 years of experience, and leads currently the office of which is in charge of formulating of development plans, comprehensive land use plans, project development and monitoring, urban master planning, and creative design for the city. She's representing Baguio City Mayor Benji, who unfortunately was not able to join us today. But Donna, we are very keen to hear how, as a local government, the city of Baguio has been able to become more resilient and smart, and how it has been using tools in order to do so. So first of all, I mean, coming back to the question, the last audience poll, coming back to that, how well do you think Baguio has utilized digital solutions to become more resilient and smart? Over to you, Donna.
Yes, thank you very much. What I can say at this very start of our presentation is that we are very well using digital technologies, especially with our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But we are looking towards that future, that's a better future where we are beyond the pandemic already. And of course, we'll still be the smart city that we intended to be. So first and foremost, a pleasant day to all the participants and viewers of the Southeast Asia Development Symposium 2021. It is with great honor that we were invited to share with you our city's experiences and future goals for this session on reinventing smart cities after COVID-19. Our mayor, Benjamin Magalong, sends his regrets for being not here with us today, but his thoughts are on the success of our efforts as we learn from each other during these most difficult times. Baguio City is relentlessly moving towards its transformation to becoming a smart city. The decision to use digital technologies was mainly driven by our urgent need to gather city data and transform it to useful information, make that information accessible, and ultimately have our citizens use it in the most immediate time possible. The citizens of Baguio are the key priority at all times. We were on the path to becoming a smart city before the pandemic, and the need for real-time data and information had been proven many times over in these times. And they are very essential indeed, especially in the integration and decision-making, especially at the local government level. One of the key learnings from this pandemic is it has made location our shared language. Next slide, please. Digital data collection, analysis, and mapping has been a very effective methodology in our data gathering and contact tracing initiatives. Our mayor was named as the contact tracing czar of the Philippines, and he exploited these methodologies and tools. The pandemic has highlighted the need to communicate to the public in real time COVID-19 trends, as well as health and safety advisories in order to flatten the curve. Because of the fluctuations of incidences, keeping abreast and strategic management had proven to be data hungry. Our efforts centered on data analytics, and key decisions were based on the information that was generated and disseminated to the public, because they were the ones who needed this information in response, because we needed their cooperation for us to orderly and effectively manage and mitigate the spread of the virus in our city. In this slide, you will see how successful we were in preventing the projected cases of COVID-19. If there were no intervention, we would have expected a positive case of 103,880, which is the red curve over there. But with our interventions and with real-time monitoring and decision-making, we were able to prevent 98,215. We are just at 5,665 cases as of February 27, 2021. Next slide, please.
We might have lost Donna. Let's see if we can get her back. In the meantime, I would like to pick up some questions which have come to us already on the Q&A platform. Maybe the first question, and I could ask, and actually this is quite a relevant question by Shannon Edwin Dilap, which is a question which I might want to ask to Amit, which is how can a country like the Philippines with slow internet connectivity cope with communication innovation that can reach our people within our respective cities? So given the limitations of internet connectivity, you know, talking about smartness, how relevant is that actually? Maybe Amit, while we try to reconnect with Donna, could you reflect on that? Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, and I'd like Wendy's response as well, because I'm not
Correct,
a technology
yes.
person, but I'm sure she has a response. But if you look at how other, you look at the agriculture sector in India, for example, farmers in rural India are able to get data information on their non-smartphones. Similarly, there are digital payments now that are easily made across, countries. There are examples from Africa, there are examples from India, where you make payment in one part of the country, you pay cash to somebody, and they use their network and technology. In another part of the country, actually, people are able to receive that funds. I think it's not the issue of just bandwidth and accessibility, because now everybody, I think Wendy's point is right. Everybody's so used to their phones, and more people are getting used to simple phones, smartphones, and getting messages on those phones. The question is, how do you coordinate the communication? So I think the challenge often is within government. Sometimes there's not the right ability or approach or enough coordination to actually give out a consistent message. So if you're in a city, you're getting maybe a message from the city government, you may be getting a message from the state government, you may be getting a message from the national government. To me, that's the bigger challenge. The technology part, at least that's my opinion, and Wendy, please jump in. The technology part and getting bit-size information is actually not that difficult. And actually, I'll recount an example. I happened to be in the US during 9/11, and then I happened to be in Kathmandu during the earthquake in 2015. And at both occasions, the one piece of technology and data that actually worked during the post earthquake and the post 9/11 situation was the ability to send text messages. And I had learned that after 9/11 that I couldn't make phone calls, but I could actually send text messages. And I happened to be in Kathmandu, and when the earthquake hit, I actually immediately sent out a text message to my family saying, I'm okay. And that worked. Voice calls did not work. So I think how you use technology, how do you set that up, that's a bigger question to me than actually the technology being able to solve that problem. Maybe Wendy, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, thank you. Wendy, go ahead.
Thank you, Amit. Well, in reality, the Philippines and Indonesia, as well as part of the Pacific Islands, have an infrastructure challenge. So part of my work in the Philippines is to encourage people to use edge computing. So that's why I talk about not just cloud computing. Cloud computing, yes, it's essential, but more essentially, without local communication within the building, you've got nothing. So let's talk about people around you. So if you have edge computing where there is still connectivity, not internet connectivity, but network connectivity that you could use to communicate with people around you, right? Maybe within the next 1 kilometer radius. That's another opportunity they can use to help keep people safe in times of disaster. In the upcoming, for urban planning purposes, like I mentioned earlier, using Bluetooth 4.0 in a mesh network, that works as well because one mobile device is a Bluetooth node, right? And you could do 127 hops before you reach your destination. So every single person is part of a node in a very big network. That is essentially you are part of a network. And if cities can employ such technology easily just by using a mobile app, just to connect and track you still maintain privacy because we don't know who that person is, but that message, as Amit was saying, can go through in a Bluetooth channel. And that will be able to overcome some of the internet connectivity challenges within countries like the Philippines or Indonesia, or even the Pacific.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Donna and Amit. Another question I wanted to pick up, and that's for Ibu Wiwi and for Søren. And that's a question from Lin Lei, how do urban planning practices change after COVID-19 and with smart tools available? So Ibu Wiwi, as an urban planner yourself, and also Søren later, when you started your career as an urban planner vis-a-vis now and maybe in 20 years time, how do you see the quality of planning changing, or the way we do plans? Maybe Ibu Wiwi first, silakan.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Yoris. I think as I've mentioned earlier in the presentation, the very key points for the future urban planning is how to limit the growth of the cities. Because when the cities grow too fast, too rapid, and create a big cities, mega urban, it will be more complex and very difficult to control the mobility, and also there's other aspects related to the environmental issues, shock and stresses, and so on. So I think the idea is first how to create a more balance, managing the emerging new urban growth to balance the development across the regions. And secondly, how to promote the smart city tools beyond the use of technology to control the mobility of the people, and to how to allocate density. And I think in the future, the smart city tools mainly to control the mobility, to limit people movement by using technology, smart tools, and so on will be very important. And hopefully in the future, we can have more cities, but with a small number of inhabitants. Yeah. Thank you, Pak Yoris.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Ibu Wiwi. And Søren, as we move to you and your reflection on how urban planning changes, one other question which came up here was on circular economy and sustainability, and how we weave that into the how we weave that into urban smart city planning. That's from Grace, a question from Grace Waska Simomura. So 5G and all advances in technology are nice to hear, but what happens to the electronic hazardous waste as all these are as a result of these products which are being prepared? So circular economy, looking at urban planning, and and how that has changed, or how that will change. Thank you, Søren, to you.
Yeah, thank you, Joris. I've been in the urban planning practice for 30 years, and I have definitely seen a huge change in the way we are practicing urban planning, coming from a situation where it was really top down, when planning was done by the elite. And put on people and societies, and then urban plan was a nice drawing on a map that were presented or informed to people, and then taking into actions and built. Now we are in a situation where the nice plan is only half, 50% of urban planning. The other 50% is communicating, engaging, branding, selling, co-creating with society. So we are now bringing in bottom-up understanding that if we actually want a plan to be realized, it has to the people that are living in it has to take ownership of the plan, and we are also realizing that people are the strongest force in accomplishing development, accomplishing the great plans. I live in Copenhagen. It was a complete car-oriented city way back. Now it is 60% of every citizen in Copenhagen are commuting on bicycles. And the only reason for this is that the citizens has taken ownership of riding bikes instead of driving cars. So I think that the urban planning has undergone quite substantial change, and all the new technologies we are discussing now that Wendy has talked about, Amit has talked about also, and those are adding to our ability to work with the people and the population of the cities, which actually is the aim of all our work. If the individual persons don't like our plan, the city or whatever we design, they don't buy it. They don't move to the city. They don't buy the house. They don't buy the car, and so on and so forth. So we need to engage and to co-create, and all these new technologies are adding to our ability to co-create and engage with people.
Thank you very much. So technology provides opportunities for communication, and it's also something which Søren and I are working on as part of the ASEAN Australia Smart Cities Trust Fund to experiment with some of these tools and techniques. We know that Donna is back, so thank you very much, Donna. You left off where we're looking at your slides on vaccination super sites. So please, apologies for that you were cut off, and please continue your presentation. Please go ahead.
Yes, I'm very sorry. These things happen, and this is one thing that the city is solving right now. That no matter what we expect from technology, when it bogs down, it just bogs down. Sure. So yes, let me just continue where I left off. So I was about to talk about our getting ready for the vaccination of the city's citizenry. And our intention is to attain a 70% herd immunity. And we actually have procured that 70% of vaccines for our citizens already. But of course, that would be a big number. That's 190,000 of our citizens. And we must make sure that we do not waste any of this. And our efforts are to inform the citizenry already of the benefits of the vaccine, as well as devising an enlistment platform and to geographically design the distribution and location of our vaccination sites. As you can see, we have 4 super sites, and we want to make sure that we will be able to move all those citizens requiring vaccination in just 7 days. And we are again dependent on digital tools and technologies. We are looking ahead to getting into that better normal. That's why we want to skip the widespread COVID-19 pandemic into our city. We are still in clustering. We are still experiencing clustering, but we are rushing towards that better normal because we would like to make sure that we are already on our path to recovery and growth. Corollary to this effort is to engage the public in a conversation about their experiences on this ongoing response. And this is what we do on our sites, either on the city's website or on Facebook. We want to make known also what are the thoughts of our citizens, especially in the foreseeable future. So we engage in these digital citizen surveys, and we want to make sure that the services that we provide, we get the necessary feedback, and especially from the people that we serve. Next slide, please. The pandemic has reinforced our resolve to become a smart city by 2022. We are now completing the Smart City Command Center and at the same time planning for its mainstreaming into the mandates and activities of different local government offices. We see this as the integration technology already. And the discourse on the use of technology as a tool ultimately boils down to the efficient delivery of government services to the people, especially those who need it most. Being smart, therefore, must always include the people who put in the necessary leadership to use this technology as a support system, and that had been proven many times over. And of course, for us to be able to bridge the gap to the people, the recipients of these decisions that we make at the local government level. Next slide, please. So while our command center is being completed, The city had been actively engaging with its stakeholders and technology partners to design, implement, and test various digital applications that would assist us in various city management and service delivery efforts. The Baguio in My Pocket application now offers digital access to some government services, but we envision that soon it will be able to support transactions, emergency and calamity notifications, as well as real-time information dissemination. We recognize that connectivity, which we just experienced right now again, this is going to be the backbone of all this endeavor towards getting smart. Thus, we entered with a national government agency, that is our Department of Information and Communications Technology, to address this challenge. We have just recently inaugurated the inclusion of telemedicine to the city's website. This is a response to the need of our people to get expert information about the virus and their health status remotely, as there is a great fear among our citizens, especially the seniors, that they do not want to go out and visit their health professionals because of this fear of getting infected. Our current engagement on the development of the flood early warning system shall enhance our disaster management and response efforts. We have just recently completed the climate and disaster risk assessment for the city, and we are looking forward to integrating the data that we were able to produce with the outcome of the early warning system project here in our city. And we are looking at a possibility or an eventuality that we would have an effective deployment. And again, information dissemination to the people who need it most would be at the forefront. It is without doubt that data analytics and digital innovation will be an influential force in our city's recovery and resiliency. It is knowledge that is available in real time that will put us on the path of environmental and fiscal sustainable growth and out of this pandemic and towards that future that I suppose everyone is hoping for already. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Donna. Much appreciated for that, and much appreciated to share the inspiring story of Baguio. One question I see on the platform is, so how can you build buy-in among citizens? This is from Paul John Gesta. How can you build buy-in among citizens, and what's the effective way to draft a citizens engagement strategy into city and urban planning? So you, as heading the planning efforts of Baguio City, how do you? I mean, we saw your QR code, but what other tools do you have to bring in that input from citizens? Thank you, Donna.
Yes, we make sure that everyone is informed as much as possible. In fact, we are designing town halls so that everyone will be informed. The only way that we could assure ourselves that there will be buy-in from our citizens is for them to know what could be had from this technology that is being deployed all over the city. I think that's the only thing. The communication has to happen, and they should be able to understand what could be the benefits of these things that are already under transformation in the city.
And these town halls you were referring to, they are now held virtually, or on what platform are they being held?
They're hybrid, in fact. So we invite people, either they could come at limited numbers because we have health protocols, but they are mainly engaged by tri-media. So mostly on Facebook, some are over Zoom, and in other ways. The radio is still being of much use in our city, and these are the media and the platforms that we make use of to ensure ourselves that the information gets to them.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, a question which, of course, ADB being a financing institution, which is, of course, of great interest to you. It's a question from Robert Dobias, which relates to where are the frontiers of finance for sustainable cities? What innovative financial tools are being suggested, tested, rolled out to allow cities to put these good ideas into full practice? So I will also say a few words about that, but maybe Søren, what do you see in terms of these innovations? How does that get financed? What are the innovations around not just the innovation in terms of planning and the tools we use there, but the innovation in financing? Thanks.
Yeah, and that's a really tough question because any developer wanting to build a building, residential building, office buildings, whatever, they are always asking what's in it for me, and when we are suggesting sustainable solutions for those guys, they are always looking at the bottom line. So where can we earn money on this? So in that space, I think the certification systems that are now being widespread, the LEED system, the British BREEAM, we're using the German DGNB systems. They are now quite widespread and known, and we now have methodologies where we can actually calculate the financial benefit of developing a city district building in a sustainable way. So we can actually document what are the financial benefits of behaving responsibly towards the climate. So I think that's one of the great tools we have for financing sustainable developments. And then I would say that there are a lot of money ready to be invested in different developments in the city, whether it's sustainable infrastructure or it's buildings or it's communication systems. There are a lot of money out there just waiting for the good plans and the good ideas to come up. But the money are not thrown in any projects, just like before the financial crisis. They are very reliant on good business cases. So building up a good business case, building up a good reporting of revenues going back to investors, those are some of the strongest instruments, you could say, for activating investments and financing. And also, for the last thing I would mention is the backup from people, because if investors see huge pushbacks and demonstrations from people, they would back off from investments and financing and just finance another project.
Thank you very much for that, Søren. That's much appreciated. As ADB, we are particularly interested, of course, in how smart technologies can be used, for example, to enhance the credit worthiness of cities. So how can you use some technology to do better tax collection, revenue collection, how to look, for example, at smartly applying land development rights. So again, here, it's not just that technology would cost money, but the application of technology, for example, to improve revenue and financial management is a way to further enhance the credit worthiness and the ability for a city to finance any innovations, any further innovations, and improve livability and to build back smarter. And that is a nice bridge to a final section which we wanted to share with you here in the webinar this afternoon, is surrounding the concept of the ASEAN Australia Smart City supported Building Back Smarter Digital Solutions for Livable Cities Challenge. We have this trust fund managed by ADB to look at how digital solutions can support cities to build back smarter and to create indeed livable cities. So if you look at what we at the moment are trying to do, next slide, please. What we at the moment want to try to do is under this trust fund, which has about $14 million in it, where we look at city planning, service delivery, and financial management, while at the same time considering gender equality, climate change, and private sector development. We try to support cities with the development, capacity development, and partnerships to find great ideas which can be scalable and replicated throughout the ASEAN region. So this trust fund gives ADB the opportunity to experiment. And for that, next slide, please. We are looking initially at a number of cities in the region, which are listed on this map. Now, if your city is on this map, great. We look forward to working with you. If it's not yet on the map, we can also have a discussion as to what extent we can collaborate. But for now, and that's the next slide, we have an opportunity for all of you to come up with ideas through the Smart Cities Datathon 2021, where we challenge innovators from around the world to tackle the idea of how to build back smarter, how can we use digital solutions to make cities more livable in 3 areas: access to urban services and amenities, participation and influencing in decision making. So that's what Donna was just talking about, and improving financial access. This is what Søren was just talking about. So these innovations, next slide, we are happy to award the $20,000 prize for seed money to test and adapt the solution in a real life setting. And we are open to anybody, whether it's startups, students, cities, even who can apply for this. The timeline for this datathon on the next slide is listed here. Today we are launching this, and it will be open for applications until May 31st. And we hope that by through a phased approach of prioritizing ideas and concepts, we will by mid-July have a number of finalists who will pitch their ideas to a grand final panel of judges. So again, the deadline for this is May 31st, 2021. Thank you for that. So on that note, I would like to thank my colleagues and the participants for your contribution in this webinar. I think there were some really exciting and interesting ideas here. As we leave, I would like to play one more small video on the challenge. I thank you very much for your attention. I thank you for the questions. I noticed that we haven't answered all of them, and there's some really interesting questions. So do get in touch with us or with any of the panelists. I see there's a very particular question to Mobiva and the alignment with pre-existing emergency management system. I see there's a question to Ibuwiwi on good examples of polycentric cities in Southeast Asia. We love to continue the discussions, and we hope to remain in touch, and that you found the past 1.5 hours useful for you. So thanks all panelists, and thank you for the audience. And let's play the video on the Smart Cities Challenge. Thank you very much. All right, thank you very much. You see the slide, will show the slide where you can apply for the challenge. And again, thank you very much and have a good day. Bye for now.